Good evening, everyone. Sorry we're a few minutes over, but it's been difficult getting everyone in. Okay, good evening. My name's John Davis. I'm recently appointed at King's as Director of Partnerships in the Policy Institute. Welcome to you all. You're very, very welcome. This is the latest in the King's College Ipsos MORI events, and this one's entitled Dear Westminster, We Need to Talk, a political review of 2014 and a look ahead to the general election. That general election is only about 5 months away, and if you're like me, you think that it's the tightest election probably since the Second World War. It's just mad, and it gets madder every day, doesn't it? So, you know, in that spirit, we've got a real Christmas cracker here of a panel that will try to untangle so many of the issues. I say to my panellists, you know, it's a big panel and we're hoping that it will get bigger. So if you can keep it very, very brief, because we do want to leave time for questions at the end. So first of all, and I'll just briefly introduce the panel. We have Ben Page, Chief Executive of Ipsos MORI. We then turn to Jim Murphy MP. We turn to Sue Cameron from the Telegraph, Katie Ghose from the from the Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society, and hopefully Lord Adonis will join us at some point. So without further ado, can I please hand over to Ben Page.
Thank you. So this is our last event of 2014, and we're just going to try and pick through what the rooms are for the general election. I think this year has been one where at the beginning of the year we asked the British public what they thought was going to happen, and one of the things that they thought that would happen was that it was more likely that we would discover life on Mars than it would be that UKIP would win the European elections, which just shows that the public know nothing. UKIP went on to win the European elections. But generally, hello Andrew, you're very welcome. But generally, you know, many of the trends that we're looking at that are going to come in some ways to a culmination, or a temporary culmination in May next year, have been brewing for some time. And one of the challenges, of course, is the relationship between Westminster and some of the denizens of it represented in this room and the public as a whole. So if you look at the trends, the biggest pattern, which is commentated on a lot, of course, is the decline in support for the two main parties in this country. Back in 1951, virtually everybody, only 3% of the public bothered to vote for anybody else. But one of the themes of this election will be that many of them will be either not voting at all or definitely voting for somebody else. And if you look at the trends, the purple lines show support for the two main parties. It also shows you that, which is a favourite saying at Ipsos MORI, that if it's interesting, it's usually wrong. And that is this sense of a massive decline in support for the two parties, which is part of the narrative for many people commentating on politics in Britain, is slightly overblown, because it is lower now. But of course, look back in the early 1980s. The SDP and the Liberals getting over 50% of the vote in some polls at that point, and where are they now? We went back to normal. So is that an inexorable drift down? We don't know, but certainly at this election it looks tough for the two main parties. They've both lost support. The Conservatives, you can see, drifting down there from the last few years. Labour ahead of the Conservatives in 2012, and now drifting down so that they're effectively neck and neck as we go into next year. And we can, you know, whether that narrative is going to keep, whether that purple line keeps drifting down, we don't know, but certainly it's going to be a challenge at the next election. And part of the reason for that is well represented in this room. Could you put up your hand if you were born after 1980? So full of Generation Y people. They're also the most miserable people in Britain, so it's really good to see you all. Could you, I don't think we've got many people born before 1945, but if you were, could you put your hand up? These are some of the happiest people in Britain. It's good to see you. But one of the challenges for anybody trying to be a politician in Britain is that the gaps between the generations now make things quite difficult. So back in the early 1980s, people who were born before 1945 tended to say that they always supported the same party, mostly the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. Now that number's drifted down a bit, but it hasn't changed much over the last 20 or 30 years. But what's interesting is that my generation, born between 1945 and 1965, are much less keen on the two main parties. Generation Y, represented by many other people in this room, 1966 to 79, are keener still, and then Generation Z and X, Y and Z, even less enthusiastic. And if you roll forward those numbers and take on board the fact that one of the reasons there aren't lots of people here who were born before 1945 is because nobody lives forever. And so over the next 10 years, people born before 1945 will diminish quite considerably in the population, whereas probably people born after 1980, you'll all still be here. What that means is that the overall line on the chart tends to drift down from around 51% of people saying they support the two main parties at the beginning of the 1980s to only a quarter in just a few years if that trend continues. And we see no reason to see why the lines at the bottom, this group of voters here, represented in this room, are suddenly going to start becoming party loyalist. You tend to shop around. You aren't born into one party or another. And that, of course, makes things very, very difficult for the traditional parties. And we think that trend is here to stay. The other one is just about the status quo. The election, or the referendum in Scotland, it's very interesting. The Scots decided to stay with the rest of the UK by perhaps a larger margin than some people were expecting. But when you look at the reasons why people were voting either to leave or to stay, you see very different patterns. The first is that the people who were voting yes said they were doing so out of hope. They were hoping that things were going to be better if they were independent. The majority, just 55% who voted no, they were actually voting no, not because they were positive about a United Kingdom, but because they were worried about they were fearful of a loss of the consequences of change, but not a brilliant, beautiful future as a United Kingdom. And I think that again suggests that the status quo itself isn't particularly attractive. When you look at how people feel about government per se, it remains a pejorative word in this country, to be honest, as it has been for most of the 27 years that I've been at Ipsos MORI. So, do you think that government acts in the interests of people like me? Well, local government does best. 26% of us think it acts in our interests, 38% disagree. The UK government as a whole, 21%, and of course the European Parliament, well, you must be joking. Although there are 12% of Brits who think it's absolutely on our side. But generally, we're not particularly in love with any layer of government. And so when we say, well, OK, so the Scots, what should we do about English votes for England versus Scottish votes for Scotland and all of that? Again, there is no settled or happy view. People in Britain always say that they want more devolution when we ask them in opinion polls, in general terms. But if you say, and indeed if you say, should England have more control over its votes, over its spending, well, let's have a look. So, what do you want to happen in England? This is laws that are just for England. Should they be, as now, by everybody in Parliament, including people from Scotland and Northern Ireland? A third say yes. Should only English MPs be allowed to vote on them? A third say yes to that. And 22% say, well, sod that, we'll have a separate English Parliament, please. But no settled or easy view. And of course, even though we say we want more devolution in this country, I don't know anybody from the north of England here, there must be some. Hi. So people obviously up, Manchester, Leeds, the great cities, of course, wondering about whether they could get some more freedom from the dead hand of Westminster. What does the great British public think about that? No. Absolutely not. They should not be given the sort of tax and spend powers that the Welsh, the Scots, and indeed the English as a whole should be allowed. So the other problem, of course, is Nigel. And one of the issues is that people are just rather, if it's a relationship between Westminster and the rest of the country, the voters are just rather disloyal. They're sort of flirting with other people. So this year, the UKIP have now reached a third place, and they're consistently ahead of the Liberal Democrats. The number of people who say that they're just a completely wasted vote, you'd be crazy to vote for them for whatever reason, is down from 57% to 41%. Now, it's true that 80% of people say that UKIP is different to other parties, and I think the news today suggesting some of their behaviour says they really may be. But nevertheless, undoubtedly an electoral force to be thought about, if not counted in the House of Commons in 2015. The SNP. This deep irony that the SNP lose the referendum and yet have a massive surge in Scotland. Jim will obviously talk about this, but it's almost as though the Scots think, well, OK, we're going to stay part of the UK, but I want some people to drive a really hard bargain down in Westminster. And it was, of course, SNP members of the House of Commons who triggered the vote of no confidence in Jim Callaghan in 1979, long before many people in this room were born, which led to 18 years of Conservative government. And they will certainly be in larger numbers in Westminster. Jim will tell us how many in a second. And of course the Greens, not so much heard about, but if you're a left-wing sort of person and are fed up with Labour and don't like the look of UKIP, the Greens are quite attractive, and their pitch is beyond greenery these days. They're collecting all sorts of interesting people, they're matching the Liberal Democrats, and they're certainly getting some of those Lib Dem protest voters who now will never vote Lib Dem again because they've sold out and gone off with government. So all of those people are doing better than they have done previously, which again makes it more and more unpredictable. There's a general issue about trust, and endless people contact us wanting data on trust for the latest book they're going to be writing about this. The general premise, of course, is that nobody trusts anybody anymore and that trust in politicians has just collapsed. Could anybody tell me how trust in politicians today would compare with around the time most people in this room were born, please? Will it be higher or lower? Higher? Lower? Same. Lots of political studies students here. This is trust in doctors. You can see that people like Harold Shipman can murder them, it doesn't make any difference. Absolutely rock solid, no change. Here's trust in journalists, Sue. Did a bit better in 2009, sort of improving slightly. We've got about 1 person in 5 who thinks you tell the truth. Then, of course, we have politicians. Not really any different, almost identical to where they were in 1983. People have never trusted politicians in this country. The people studying, even in 1944, we know that Gallup reported that only 35% of voters in 1944 believed that the British government, British politicians were acting in the interests of the country. The rest thought they were acting, So we've never really liked politicians. And of course, then we've got civil servants. There must be some civil servants in the room. Yes, look at this. Trust is rising, particularly amongst the young. We're really trying to understand why this is. We think it may be something to do with the stop of repeats of Yes Minister, but you can still find it on YouTube if you haven't seen it. And then we need to look at pollsters, of course. Now, the trouble with pollsters is that there are too many of us these days, so trust in pollsters is flat, but sort of, not where it should be. But overall, not necessarily. Most of those lines are pretty flat. They don't suggest a massive crisis of trust in the professions, at least, in terms of their veracity. But have a look at this. This is the British Social Attitude Study, and this is the proportion of people who say they almost never trust a government to put the needs of the country above their narrow sectarian interests. And whoops, something interesting is happening with the chart. Stop that. No, don't do that. Oh, down here, that's a good one. And so up from around 1 in 10 to well over 3 in 10 people saying they almost never trust the government. And so while trust isn't necessarily collapsing, certainly our trust in big institutions is under pressure, particularly government. The other issue is that because of some of these differences that our work on generations has explored, and Bobby Duffy and his colleagues in the Social Research Institute have talked about, it's not just that we're going off party politics, we're also going off many other institutions, including traditional attitudes to homosexuality, in other words, it's illegal, but also things like religion and indeed the welfare state. So, for example, do you think you're religious? People born before 1945? Generally, yes, they haven't gone off religion. But each successive generation is rather less enthusiastic, and it's only really partly because of immigration that Britain's going to keep religion. We keep importing lots of religious people, which is good if you think religion is good in society. So these big generational differences are present not just in attitudes to politics, but also in attitudes to religion and indeed to things like the welfare state. People born before 1945 always say that the creation of the welfare state in Britain was one of its proudest achievements. But each successive generation, the baby boomers here in grey, a bit less enthusiastic, Generation X, born 1966 to 79, less enthusiastic still, Generation Y, who've actually had the worst deal in many ways from the welfare state. These people have had all of their benefits protected during the cuts, free TV licenses, free winter fuel allowance. Everything's fine if you're a pensioner. We're actually transferring wealth at the moment from the young to pensioners. But the young are most sort of sceptical about that, but also many, many collectivist institutions. It doesn't mean to say that they're all becoming conservative voters. That isn't true. Labour is still well ahead amongst the young, but they're very, very different in their attitudes to things like homosexuality or the role of men and women to previous generations. Much more individualistic and much more libertarian of a small L. And so the problem that politics have isn't unique to politics. It's part of generational change in this country. So what's going to happen in 2015? I'm a pollster, so I should know. And the simple answer, I have absolutely no idea. What I can say is that it's going to be a fairly loveless election, if we're talking about relationships. Back in March of 2010, we had 59% of people predicting, as the British public does have some wisdom in crowds, that that election would lead to a hung parliament. 24% thought the Conservatives would be the largest party, 32%, 10% said Labour would actually get a majority. They must be true believers if they thought Gordon Brown was going to get a majority. Overall, the third thought Labour would be the largest party. But overall, if you look at these two shares here, a hung parliament of Labour, the biggest party, or a hung parliament of the Conservatives, the biggest party, 6 in 10 people before that election believed. They didn't say they wanted it, and afterwards they thought coalitions were bad, but that's what they voted for and that's what they got. It's the wisdom of crowds. This election, then, what's going to happen? 73% are now saying that they think it's most likely that there will be a hung parliament. This has only ever happened once before in history in this country, 2 consecutive coalition governments, if that's what we get. But they're pretty, they're pretty convinced that nobody's going to win, and so are we. The end. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Jim, your next lectern, or just there?
Okay. I'll stand here if you're okay. Is that okay? Yep. If folk are okay. Can you hear me? Okay, well, you'll be disappointed with that. I was looking, Ben, at what you were saying. I'm a representative of Generation X. I only make it by 1 year. I don't know whether that was I meant to be more pessimistic, more optimistic.
I think it makes you slightly more optimistic.
Than you?
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Oh, okay. And if you believe, it was fascinating, the presentation of both Ben and Ipsos MORI. And if you believe everything that you've seen there, you're right to believe it, but you're also in the minority. Because as Ben said, two-thirds of the public don't believe a word that pollsters say. That doesn't make you wrong, and it doesn't make Ipsos MORI wrong. It just means you're in a minority, but you're in a believing minority. And that was I'm going to talk a little bit about the Scottish referendum, because there was a little bit of that about as well during the referendum, because faith was often more important than fact. Assertion more than evidence ruled the day in many people's minds. And Katie's going to tell you about a focus group. We've been given 5 minutes each, incidentally, so I'll try to keep within it. But Katie's going to talk to you about a Glasgow focus group. And I'm going to share with you a different Glasgow focus group that I encountered during the referendum. I went round my country, 100 different places in 100 days, standing on the upturned crates of Scotland's other national drink, Iron Brew. I'm standing in street corners, just engaging with people who weren't engaged in politics, because it was the most important decision we were ever going to take. And I wanted to reach out to people who were all referendumed out, people who were turning off the telly and no longer reading the newspapers, who might get engaged in a public argument in the street corner with a tall, skinny guy from Glasgow standing on soft drink crates. And it was great. It's the best thing I've ever done in politics. The most enjoyable thing. It was unspinnable, it was unspun, it was uncontrollable. People threw things at me. People occasionally said nice things, but more than often got involved in a genuine heated political argument. And it was fantastic. But the extent to which that highlighted to me the degree to which the referendum had become part of Scotland's consciousness. And the way that politics has really been in the past, anywhere in the UK, but particularly in England, where English political debate is often pretty dormant, certainly the sense of identity is secondary in terms of the political debate. But, and Katie's talking about this, we'll talk about this focus group. Mine was in a DiMaggio's, a pizza place, where I was out with friends, and the table next to me was a group of Glaswegian women who were out celebrating one of their friends' hen night. The hen night's the same in England, isn't it? Yeah. A hen night, the women go out and get pissed. The night before the wedding. So here they were, these women were following kind of tradition, slamming tequilas. The bride-to-be had a necklace of condoms round her neck, unused condoms round her neck. I know we were talking about religion earlier, Ben, so apologies to kind of folk who that annoys. And rather than just talking about what you're wearing, where are we going, what are we doing, what's the wedding going to be like, they were genuinely discussing the detail of macroeconomics, right, and a fiscal currency. as to whether a fiscal currency between an independent Scotland and a residual UK was in any way tenable or desirable. Now, they didn't come to a conclusion, so they just got on with the tequila slammers, but the extent to which politics for the moment mattered was remarkable, and it captured the entire nation. And the lesson I take from all of this is, firstly, Ben said that the response to the referendum has been surprised, and it has been, because my party, the Labour Party, was part of the winning coalition in terms of being part of the more than 55% who voted no. And of course the SNP are part of the coalition that lost the referendum. But the Labour Party has been magnanimous in our victory, and the SNP have been victorious in their defeat. I mean, for those who wish to analyse the kind of nature of political energy and the way in which constitutional nationalism doesn't leave space for self-doubt or another argument, then what happened not during the campaign to the referendum, but what happened since, is a much better test case and kind of study to look at for political scientists and those who want to analyse these things. But the lessons I draw are just three quick things in 30 seconds on each. Hope versus fear. Both parties in the argument kind of tried to play that axis in varying degrees. And the hope figure amongst the yes voters, some yes, it was about hope that with one bound we'd be free and Scotland would be more prosperous. But my sense is it wasn't about that. It wasn't about a constitutional hope. It was about hope from freeing themselves from that bad man Cameron and that even worse eccentric man Farage. And it was about a sense of Scotland could be free of the Tories. Now, my argument was more complicated in that regard, because a fiscal union within England, which would be run by Cameron, would lead to no sense of freedom in any sense whatsoever in terms of politics. But hope versus fear was crucial. The second lesson is that politics matters. Politics matters in a way that if you digest an argument and make it relevant, people will engage in ways that you would never imagine, and I don't think anywhere in England, and certainly before the referendum, Scotland had never, in my lifetime, as a member of Generation X, had never experienced, and I don't think perhaps even in the 1945 election where Attlee won that unexpected landslide, even then probably not, even when the argument was about building a welfare state and homes fit for heroes, there was mass participation in elections, but not in the extent of the referendum. And that's a lesson for the election in May of next year, where prove that politics matters and people will become engaged. And the last lesson that I think politicians fail to grasp, perhaps probably myself included, is that the decision is always a mix of reason and emotion. So why do 2/3 of people not believe pollsters? There's no reason to it. It's an emotion, it's an instinctive demise of deference, and actually the death of deference, which I don't really mind that much. But there's an extent to which, in our minds, we play off an argument of logic and emotion. And the referendum was part of that, where people set aside all the evidence and made their decision based upon what they believed and felt. Not in a sense of faith in an old traditional religion, but a sense of what felt right. And that's the last lesson for me in the forthcoming general election, is for politicians of all parties, yes, to have the dry macroeconomics of the growth figures and debt and deficit, but the big challenge, I think, in the UK general election, and the prize will go to the party and the candidates who most connect with the visceral sense of emotion and the desperate desire for change that hasn't just swept Scotland, but will also, I think, capture the rest of the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Over to you, Sue.
Well, I think that what this year has shown, and I am, I guess, is that all right? Can you hear me? I'll move over a bit. Part of the Westminster bubble. But what we've clearly seen, as Ben said, is the pretty much collapse of the traditional parties, their memberships down, their share of the votes down, they're losing out to the smaller parties. And the worrying thing is that it seems to me that neither the Tories, nor Labour, nor the Lib Dems are quite sure what to do about it. They're desperate almost to believe that it's a bit of an aberration. UKIP wins the Euro elections in May. Well, it's a protest vote. It won't be like that in a Westminster election. Scottish referendum, no worries, the Scots won't vote to leave. Well, they didn't, but as Jim said, the SNP has been victorious in defeat. And in an interview, I don't know if she's here, with Miranda Green in Newsweek, Alex Salmon shows that he knows what's going on. I think he's absolutely right. He said that the traditional parties are seeing things in terms of what is my next move going to be on the political chessboard. And what they don't realise is that the board is being whisked away from under them and thrown out. And in response, for example, to the UKIP threat, the Westminster traditionalists come up with things like a referendum on Europe or a tougher line on immigration. Yet most voters don't take much interest in detailed policies. It's not the policies that upset so many of them, turn so many of them off. It's the politicians, out of touch, remote, incompetent, leaders who sneer at the electorate, see them as loonies, bigots, a lumpen mass with half-formed thoughts and fully formed prejudices. And efforts to appease this disaffected electorate with proposals for constitutional change, I think Andrew might talk a bit about that in a minute. But, there's talk of devolution in England, an English parliament, a constitutional convention, even, I think MPs came up with this, the possibility of forcing people to vote, compulsory voting. But as Ben said, the trouble is, whenever voters are asked about things like regional assemblies or elected mayors, they're just not interested. And as John Major once said, if the answer is more government, then you're asking the wrong question. Calls for decentralisation do, I think, resonate, but primarily they're part of this really, really strong anti-Westminster tide, and they focus on political process which doesn't resonate with the voters. I think Scotland, the Scottish referendum was very different in many ways. It was a clear-cut question that people could and did engage with, but I don't think that's what's happening down here. And some of these constitutional changes that are being suggested can even be seen as a way of shoring up, desperate attempt to shore up the traditional parties. For example, to take one case, to protect the Labour Party from evil English votes for English laws. Because with Labour fearing that it would be harder for them to form a UK-wide government if they couldn't rely on their Scottish votes, it's something that bothers them and something that rather pleases the Tories. A cabinet committee was set up under William Hague to look at evil. I think this was meant to report today or tomorrow. The Labour Party isn't having anything to do with it, but the Lib Dems are. But my understanding is the timing slipped a bit. It's expected to come up with 3 different options to ensure that only English MPs ultimately, or they have the final say on English laws. But never mind the details of what that proposes. The politics are that the Tories are going to try and use it as a grievance more than a solution, so they can attack Labour for trampling on English rights. And Labour will respond by putting up all sorts of nerdy arguments that it would create second-class MPs. Seems to me we already have second-class MPs. They're the ones whose party hasn't won the last general election and can't force their policies through the Commons. And if Labour, for instance, wants to call the shots on English health, education, etc., all it's got to do is win the general election in England, as it's done often enough in the past. But fascinating though all this stuff is, perhaps for us, it's not something that is really going to grab the voters. It's not going to engage them in the way that the possibility of Scottish independence did. It's not going to create that sense of hope that, as Ben said, those who voted yes tended to do it out of hope. And the fact is that we are bumbling our way forward, and the parties haven't really got a definite sense of what they can do to bring the voters back to them. One of the things about English votes for English laws is it raises the question of whether a Labour Prime Minister could become Prime Minister of the whole of the UK without his relying on his Scottish votes. I think the answer to that must be that of course he could, because the chances are that after next May we are going to have multi-party government in a way. We're going to have a minority government, and in a minority government, a Prime Minister from any party would have to build support for his policies. And it could be great fun to watch. The haggling could be absolutely tremendous. There could be all sorts of demands. We'll only support you if. There'll be all sorts of people, the Irish, the SNP, UKIP, saying you've got to go to the money tree and give it a shake or we won't support you. But it could also mean that because support has to be built piece by piece, policy by policy, that the voters could get much more consensual politics and perhaps get the kind of government that might appeal to them far more, and it could also possibly change the culture of Westminster, which the voters so dislike, the sort of Yaboo sucks, which so often is synthetic, it's not real, and we've seen a bit of it just in the last few days over the autumn statement. So maybe other things need to be done. The traditional parties perhaps have got to realign and rebrand themselves. But it could be that out of the coming year, we do start to see the emergence of a better politics than we've had.
Katie, please.
Great, thank you. Good evening, thank you very much. Can you all hear me at the back? Great. So sort of Ben kicked off by saying, the public know nothing and Generation Y are miserable. And then we heard this brilliant example of the hen night and the sheer ability of people to deliberate and come to decisions on quite complex issues when they're given the information and the ability to do so. So I think I'm going to go with the faith in people, if you like. Rather than despair. I've been asked just to share a few thoughts on possible solutions to political disengagement, but in particular on whether or not I think there's a need for a constitutional convention. Two clear messages from the referendum in Scotland. When it matters, as Jim has said, people will turn out. When your voice will be heard and your vote will count, then people will participate in huge numbers. And the discussion group that I sat in on several months before the referendum in Glasgow was a group of habitual non-voters, people who never vote. There was a younger group who never voted, and there was an older group of people. And then when asked, are you going to take part in the referendum? Every single person bar one said yes. Why? Because it's the future of my country. It really, really matters. The stakes were high. And the only individual who wasn't had incredibly principled reasons, didn't feel they'd lived long enough in Scotland to be able to make that choice. So that came across kind of loud and clear to me. And of course, in a referendum, arguably unlike in a general election under our winner-takes-all system, every single vote really does count. And I think that influences people. The second reason, or sort of message, if you like, is that kind of general dislike and distrust of Westminster, which really did play a pivotal role in the decisions that people made in the referendum. And when people were asked by Lord Ashcroft on referendum day why they were voting the way they were, 74% cited disaffection with Westminster politics as one of their top 3 reasons for supporting independence. It was the highest percentage by any sort of significant margin, the second being the NHS. So I think there's some really big messages there. We know from our own public engagement exercises in bringing citizens together to deliberate on the future of their democracy in Scotland, a process we ran over some 13 months called Democracy Maps, where we gave people the space to talk about the kind of democracy they wanted to see in 2050. But the strongest message that came from that was a real desire to have more local democracy, stronger local democracy and more power in their hands at a local level, because a lot of people feel that Holyrood is as distant from their lives as Westminster is. and that comes across loud and clear. So for me, that picture suggests that returning to politics as usual won't work, and that the top-down, closed-door decisions about how our countries are run isn't going to hold legitimacy, and that only talking about transferring power from one elite institution to another, while that is crucially important, isn't going to satisfy modern citizens who as Ben has talked about, we're sort of different creatures, if you like. Something that's been quietly on the rise in this country and in others is deliberative democracy. The idea, which I think is really powerful, that citizens and elected representatives take shared responsibility for discussing and deciding on major issues, often of a constitutional nature. And when you look at participatory budgeting or simple local exercises where actually MPs take the time and the space to talk to citizens and involve them in discussions with local councillors about at the local level, right through to constitutional conventions that have taken place in Ireland and Iceland and other countries. I think there is something there, and there has been some testing of a different way of doing politics. And returning for a minute to that discussion group I was in Glasgow, something that really came across to me was this huge expectation, I thought quite unrealistically, that the citizens had of politicians. Politicians work harder than they've ever done before in terms of the casework that they do. They spend more time in their constituency than they've ever done before. But one of the paradoxes is that they get no reward from that, really, from voters. And what came across in the discussion group I was in, that people really expected information to be coming to them. And perhaps there's something there about sort of where you're seeing social attitudes reflected in politics. And I suppose that's why I feel really passionately that we do have to look at a different way of doing politics, where all of us take responsibility for these really difficult decisions. There's a reason why there's not an obvious solution to English votes for English laws, and it's not just the politics of it, which are very, very difficult. It's because it is genuinely difficult to come up with solutions to some of these things. We have done constitutional reform piecemeal in a terribly sort of British way, and some of these decisions are genuinely tricky, and I think there's something to be said for bringing citizens and politicians together to grapple with them. So I think it's time for the UK to set up a constitutional convention or a series of conventions to make decisions about the future shape of the UK. There are some very obvious questions that need answering. How should countries within the Union relate to each other, and how should power be devolved? Now, I think I challenge Sue on the idea that these things are just too abstract and they don't matter. I think all of us do care about how our public services are run and at what level those services are delivered, and I think these things are practical issues for people. So I think the sort of core idea of a convention is that you're giving citizens a job to do, you're giving them a number of questions to address, they have to inform themselves and they have to gather others' views. And we know from the Irish example of a constitutional convention that some of you will be familiar with, that there was a 2/3 majority of citizens randomly selected, sitting down as equals with 1/3 elected representatives. And I think the power of that, where everybody takes their hats off, there are no vested interests, you sit down as equals to deliberate and make decisions on the issues of the day, I think can work really well. There's plenty of examples out there. Just to sort of end by giving a little bit of a flavour of what it looks like, the participants in the convention have a kind of a roving role. They actually have to go out and have public meetings and take evidence from people on the questions that they've been given. They then have a deliberative role where they would come together in a public hall and actually meet as the participants of that assembly and really get to grips with some of those issues. So I think that has to be the way forward. It would be ambitious and unbelievably groundbreaking in the UK, because the conventions that have happened elsewhere have been in little places relatively with quite homogenous populations. So I think it would be a massive thing for us to do as the UK, but I think we should do it. For those reasons, I think that testing it out is key, and I'm working with lots of people from different organisations to get a couple of mini convention pilots going. Jim, you said that the democracy debate is dormant in England. I think you're absolutely right. Scots have had a couple of years of this incredible, describing that it's got to the level of people on the hen night talking about democracy. It's been in the mainstream. That hasn't happened in England. There hasn't been the catalyst, as Sue said, of a referendum. So we're going to have to find ways to create that. So I think a northern city region pilot and a southern city region pilot in England to test out what a convention would be like would be a fantastic thing to do. And it's something that we really want to make happen. So just to end, there is a job to be done. There are concrete questions coming out of Scotland, which was the beginning of a constitutional conversation for the UK, not the end of one. We have to work out where we want power to lie in a modern democracy. But I think in the course of answering those questions and coming to those recommendations, I think we could also establish a completely different way of doing politics. I think we could take the spirit of the massive engagement in Scotland, but apply it to the real questions about the future of the UK. Thank you.
Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, John. Now, Ben brutally exposed the huge sense of disconnect and alienation there is in this hall between us ancients on the platform and all you born after 1980. I think some of you after 1970. I mean, it gets almost impossibly young in the hall. For me, this is a very salutary experience because I'm a member of the House of Lords, which I joined at the age of 43. And when I processed in wearing these even more alienating garments that you wear there, somebody muttered sotto voce, but it ricocheted around the chamber, "My God, it's child labour." That's the age of 43 in the Lords. I'm now 51, and which makes me a juvenile in House of Lords terms. You come of age at about the age of 60, and the average age in the Lords, the average, so think about your standard deviations, or the average age is 71. Jeez. And the oldest member, who's actually one of the most distinguished, is Lord Carrington, who still turns up every day at the age of 94, who became a member of the House of Lords before Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940. So we really do, they carry on a long time. Apparently it adds at least 10 years to your life expectancy of being there. However, one of the great virtues of this is that every day, when I start in the Lords every day, the first thing you have to read is an absolute requirement, is the obituaries in the Times. You've got to know who's still around and who isn't around. However, you see before you and around you the political life of this country over the last 50 years. As I was voting, sorry, I was slightly late, we were voting on actually a quite important proposal not to set up a new generation of Borstals, which the government wants to do at the moment. A very passionate debate in the Lords, unusually passionate. It's normally not a very passionate place. But I was walking through the lobby with Geoffrey Howe, who was the first I've ever seen him rebel against the government. But Geoffrey Howe was Chancellor in 1979 and looking extremely distinguished and ancient. Now you see the whole of these cabinets of years gone by before you. And it reminded me of the fact that my student politics was in a party called the SDP, which most of you have heard of, not the SNP, it's not the SNP Light, the SDP, Social Democratic Party, which was a breakaway from the Labour Party, though I'd never belonged to the Labour Party. For me, it was my entry into politics in 1981. I joined it on my 18th birthday in 1981, and we were then going to break the mould of British politics. This was Roy Jenkins' great slogan. We were this corrupt two-party system which had destroyed the country. The 1970s, when the dead were unburied, piles of rubbish in the street, minor strikes, 3-day weeks. You think things are bad now. The country came on the verge of complete ungovernability. Then, reaction to this, two governments which massively failed. The Heath government, which essentially disintegrated in 1973-4 in a massive miners' strike and a 3-day week, and the Callaghan government, which gave up. I mean, literally, the government gave up. Remember, Jim in Guadeloupe? It was Guadeloupe, wasn't he? He went to Guadeloupe, sunning himself with the G, whatever it was then, 5, with Carter and Co. on the beach in Guadeloupe, while there were strikes, the dead unburied, and no semblance of governability here, and then comes back to Heathrow and announces crisis. What crisis? It was in reaction to that massive ungovernability, huge failure, that the two-party system comes under massive strain. It had already come under strain in the 70s. Remember Jeremy Thorpe, who we've been celebrating in the last few days? Huge strain, but easily the most popular figure in the February 74 election. Brilliant anecdotes of him in today's papers. One of him campaigning in Bath, where he had asserted he's by far the most popular party leader coming from nowhere in February 74. And of course, the Liberals poll 20% of the votes. They don't win many seats, but they have a big breakthrough, UKIP style breakthrough. Jeremy Thorpe, the great card of the election, campaigning in Bath on his soapbox, and somebody keeps heckling him, saying, Jerry, go for it. And he stops and says, Madam, he says, I am neither an oil can nor a German, but I do appreciate your good wishes. I mean, this is a great breakthrough figure of the 70s. And in 82, only 1 year before the 83 election, as I remember vividly, campaigning in the in the Bermondsey by-election, the Lib Dems, and then the Hill Head by-election. You know, what the last Londoner, Englishman who probably get elected for a Scottish constituency, Roy Jenkins, the son of a Welsh miner who sat for constituencies in London and Birmingham and then makes his great comeback in Glasgow Hill Head. And I remember going up there campaigning, and Roy wins his by-election there a week before the outbreak of the Falklands War, when the SDP is in the high 40s in the polls, but it falls back in the 83 election, but it still falls back with the SDP polling 26%, Labour only at 28%. All of the debate then is the Labour Party finished? Could it possibly revive after the Michael Foot longest suicide note in history? And of course, there's a huge sense of alienation there was from the mainstream and the Conservatives under Thatcher. So my looking back at it, and these things do rise and fall. The two-party system reasserts itself really significantly in the late 90s. Tony Blair comes in 97 with 45% of the vote, which is a high by historic standards, and the two parties having nearly 80% of the vote between them. My diagnosis of the situation is actually very straightforward. It's that the reason why the two parties have found it so tough and are finding it so tough going into the election next year is because the country isn't in great shape. When the established parties seem to have failed, and Labour was, of course, seen to have failed in 2010 after the financial crisis, and the Conservatives have presided over a very weak economy as far as ordinary people are concerned and their living standards, then there's no great plaudits for the political leaders. And you do then get insurgent parties. It's now UKIP. It was the Liberals in the 70s, it was the SDP in the 80s. It might have been the Liberals again today, but the problem is that the Liberals are in government, so they've moved from being a don't know party to a no party, so the vacuum had to be filled. And the optimist in me takes the view that as governments start finding solutions again, I hope it'll be a Labour government in a few months' time that finds the solution. It certainly isn't this present government that's found the solution, that then the two major parties will come back more into the frame. I don't see this as an unstoppable decline unless government succeeds government and proves to be unable to tackle this fundamental issue of delivering a stronger economy that leads to higher living standards for the mainstream majority, and that simply hasn't happened since the crash. Two other points. Firstly, local government. It was striking, though it didn't quite fit Ben's narrative about all politicians being out of favour. He glossed it slightly. But if you looked at that slide on what people think of national and local politics, there was quite a sharp divergence between the local and the national. 49%, if I did my maths correctly, either strongly agreed or agreed that local politicians do a good job. Now, actually, again, that isn't... People say the local is always more popular than the national. That clearly isn't the case. My generation in the 1980s, this was the loony left, and on the one side, which was, remember Ted Knight and all that lot who were running London local government, you had that on the one side, and you had the Nicholas Ridley view of the ideal Tory local government on the other side. Remember what that was supposed to do, meet once a year to hand out the contracts. So local government didn't have a great name then. Local services were a byword for disaster. In the rubbish, the schools, pretty well everything, the libraries, pretty well everything run by a local authority was. That's changed a lot. Why has it changed? Actually, because local politics in the last 15 years has become a lot less ideological and a lot more focused on really efficient service delivery and listening to the voters. And there's a big lesson in that for national politics too. And in my experience of local and London-wide politics, where I've been very engaged in recent months, where you've had good local authorities delivering good quality services, they get re-elected. Where you have poor quality local councils delivering poor services, they lose elections. It's as simple as that. And again, this story of universal woe, one of the best institutions that's been created politically in the last 15 years is the Mayoralty of London and the Greater London Assembly. People's view of London-wide services has been transformed for the better. Again, wind back 15 years ago, and London Transport didn't work at all. It was a complete basket case. It was partly in response to that Tony Blair not only proposed setting up the Mayor of London, but remember, won a referendum on setting up the Mayor of London. And the combination of Boris and Ken between them, with Boris has essentially implemented the Ken agenda that was established has been a transformation in the quality of what is a key London-wide service, which has been very poorly delivered, which was transport before. Huge investment in London public transport, a doubling in bus usage, a doubling, more than doubling in tube and rail usage, the Oyster card, a transformation in technology, and so the story goes on. It's been a hugely positive story, and we need to learn that at national level. Now, then final thought, we're not doing a great job of learning that at national level because too many of our national politicians are talking about issues that don't really care to the public at large at all. And I think, reflecting on the last 3 years, the single best decision, I think, that Ed Miliband took, the single best by far, was not to play the UKIP game and call for a referendum on Europe in the next Parliament. At the time, because I was a party to some of those discussions, there were some people who thought that this would put us out of touch with what was an unstoppable momentum towards a referendum and people wanting their say, and UKIP would be even more rampant if there wasn't a referendum on offer. Well, in the experience of the Scottish referendum, the idea that we want to spend the whole of the next 4 years debating our membership of the European Union, I mean, you must be crazy if you think that that's a great thing to do. But the point which became very clear once Ed took that decision is that though there is a small constituency, and it's actually a small constituency even of people who are voting UKIP, who want to spend all their time going over the fine print of our membership of the EU and holding an in-out referendum, it is not where the mainstream majority are at all. What they want is better public services, a better functioning economy, and more and better jobs. They do not want massive distraction of renegotiation, which everybody knows will not produce much that's different, of our membership of the EU, then an in-out referendum, which is completely apart from the big issues which are facing the country. And for my party, nothing has done more to boost our support from business than that decision. And everywhere I go now, where I go round with and meet business people, small and large, where they start is, thank God you're not going to spend the next 3 years pulling our membership of the EU up by the roots, looking at it and holding a referendum, only to tell us at the end that thanks to this great renegotiation, we think that there should be a yes vote for staying in, and all of the political leaders desperately try to get the yes vote from a referendum that was quite unnecessary for them to have called in the first place. So I'm an optimist. Once we get governments that are better at providing solutions than they have been since the crash in 2008, the two parties will come back into their own. My lot weren't great at it before 2010. The present lot haven't been great at it in the last 5 years. Obviously, people are looking for protests in that context. But if you look at what's happening in local government and in London-wide governments, then it is possible for governments to have good stories to tell about service improvement, meeting the needs of voters, and we just need to start telling it better based on real records of achievement in Westminster. Thanks.
Okay, can I have pithy, to-the-point questions? Can I have your name and affiliation? And please wait for the roving mic. So, who's first? Right in the middle.
Hi, good evening. My name is Mayowa and I'm from King's College London. Isn't the big problem that there's no electorally viable way of changing the political makeup of Westminster? And indeed, we haven't had a rigorous debate about the electoral systems we should be using, nor have we had debates about where power should be located in this country.
Who'd like to answer that?
Could you tell us? I couldn't hear it all, I'm afraid.
Take a few questions.
Sorry?
Yes, my question was, isn't the big frustration in the electorate right now the fact there's no electorally viable way of changing the political makeup at Westminster because of first past the post? And also, we haven't had a rigorous debate.
It's a first past the post question.
Electoral systems we should be using.
All right, yep, a good suggestion from the panel. Shall we take another 2 questions and answer it all at once? So who's next? Another one in the middle there, please.
Hi. Hi, my name's Nick Seaford. I work in the civil service. Katie spoke sort of a lot about deliberative democracy, but I was just sort of wondering, aren't the sort of really big things that people care about, sort of the economy, public services, taxation levels, and isn't it slightly hard to engage 60 million people in a sort of deliberative way to sort of solve those challenges that have to be done at least some level of centralisation?
Thank you. And a third question? Over there, please.
Hi, my name's Martin Bailey. I'm from LSE. I was interested in the statistic about distrust of parties and the perception that they tend to act in their own party's interest. Does the panel think it's possible that the next election for our leading politicians to have a post-partisan debate, or to actually talk in a way in which people like myself will engage? In other words, are they able to talk about politics without talking about their party?
Okay, who's first?
Well, all right, I'll have a bash. I mean, people did just get a vote on changing first past the post, so they were given an opportunity, and they decided not to do it. I think one of the difficulties with the system is that, it's back to Churchill. It's the least, our system, even this particular system of democracy, might be in some ways the least worst system. People, on devolution, we know that people like local government more, and I absolutely reinforce all the things Andrew said, where Hackney Council now has 79% of people are satisfied with the way it's delivering services. That would be frankly incredible in the early 1980s. But the difficulty is that there is no settled view amongst the public. I mean, Blair in his autobiography at one point says, well, I did try asking the public, and of course they had lots of different views. And just on that other point about the scale of deliberative polling, I mean, we have been doing deliberative polling for decades. We absolutely, and I am a fan, but there is going to be a challenge of how you get 60 million people, or very large numbers of people, to engage on something which can seem quite arcane to some people. Doesn't mean to say it's impossible. I do think that trying to do that with the press that we have might be very, very difficult indeed, but I'm all for us trying. I think it's healthy, but there is always a problem about, well, those people who went there, are their views the same as everybody else after they've been through that process? We once were doing work on spending in Norfolk, and we got people in, and they arrive in this place and start by thinking the public sector is a complete rip-off, council tax is outrageous, and the council's clearly wasting huge amounts of money. After a day of deliberation, looking at all of the books, understanding the arguments, people of all political parties end up saying, well, actually, we should probably pay more tax in Norfolk. And the county council, Norfolk County Council, said, well, how long would it take to get the entire population of Norfolk to attend one of these workshops? And of course, the answer is some time. So there are great benefits of deliberative polling. The challenge is how you do it at scale, and particularly how you communicate that. You paid these people to come? What sort of people were they? These are some of the challenges. They aren't insurmountable, but they are a challenge. And on post-partisan, on non-partisan debate, actually, on many issues, particularly at local level, politicians do that day in, day out, and that's actually more political debate in this country in terms of delivering services is actually non-partisan than what you see in the papers. But it is a particular problem in Westminster. There are issues that we have dealt with in that way. Pensions is one where politicians of both parties have come up with a solution where everybody's going to pay a bit more and work longer, and we aren't arguing the toss about it. Paying for social care is not one that we've managed to achieve the same position on. So sometimes we do it, and the public probably, they say they want it more, but PMQs get a lot of press coverage.
Would you agree, Ben, on the electoral issue, that while it is unquestioned that we were given the ability to decide, in a very real way, it also became a political football within the coalition between Cameron and his backbenchers too, and so something of real supreme importance, sadly, got lost in the mud a bit.
Obviously, the Yes to AV campaign wasn't very as effective as it should have been. Yeah. I think you could probably safely say, depending on your point of view. Yeah. And lots of people want change. And I mean, one of the interesting things about the election may be that, if UKIP get more votes than the Lib Dems and have far fewer MPs, and all of, one scenario predicted by one of my colleagues in this room is that if both the main parties get 33.4% of the vote, perfectly plausible that could happen. Labour get 307 MPs on some projections, and the Conservatives 254. at that point, maybe the Conservatives think we do actually need some change.
This side of the panel? Would you like to? Yeah, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously no surprises that I don't think the way we choose our representatives is fit for purpose. I don't think it has been for some time. I think what we're seeing is, I think I'd slightly disagree with Andrew. I mean, we are firmly in an era of multi-party politics. These are long-term trends. We have a shop-around electorate. People do not have lifelong attachments to anything anymore, really, whether that's to voting or to one party. And I think these are quite firmly established trends. And then the question then is, how much does it matter to us that every voice is heard, that every vote is valued, and then that those votes are proportionally translated into seats? Now, to some people that really matters, to others that doesn't. And I think what's going to be fascinating after this election, as others have suggested, is, I suppose, to what extent more people feel a sense of injustice, and whether that does sort of prompt the parties into action. So I think the example of UKIP supporters of voters perhaps seeing that share of the vote isn't translated to votes, but other supporters of the other non-established, as long-established parties as well. And that's something that we don't know. What we're also going to see is almost some quite random results, and I think some we're used to MPs being elected with actually not a very large amount of local support. That's one of the things our system does. But we might see MPs being elected with sort of just 30% of the vote in some of the seats. Again, how will voters feel about that? And I think that's what's going to be really interesting. In terms of these kind of questions, yes, it is going to be hugely, hugely challenging for us to do a constitutional convention. The idea that we should say, no, because people they're not interested in this, they're not capable of discussing it, it's all the economy, it's all the public service, it shouldn't be an either or. How can we decide where power lies when these are questions, as we saw in Scotland, they're about fundamental identity? Politicians can't make those decisions on their own. The questions of where power lies and all the rest of it. So I think we're really going to challenge that. As Ben suggested, it's challenging, but there are really practical ways to do this, and there's lots of examples around the world that we can learn from. We could then find a way of doing it that really, really worked from us. I think we should actually start off with an England-only convention. We could have mini regional assemblies around the country that could feed into an England one. So I just think we need to put our heads together, get the kind of best brains to do this and make it happen.
Please.
Could I just say one thing that Katie said? You were suggesting I didn't think some of these things mattered. I wasn't suggesting that they didn't matter. I think a lot of them are very important, but I don't think it is a way to re-engage the public, certainly with the main political parties, or indeed in politics generally. I think it is extremely difficult, and indeed I would say impossible, to engage 60 million people or even the 50 million people in England as to what we should do next. I think apart from anything else, people have got lives to lead, they've got homes to run, children to bring up, jobs to go to. They don't want to spend their time, even on a computer in the privacy of their own home, making decisions as to what should happen, even locally, on whether you should close the swimming pool or the library. They're not, I think, in favour of do-it-yourself government. That's what they pay the politicians and elect the politicians to do. I don't mean that nobody's interested, of course not, and people do care about things like local services. But I think that it is just not realistic to think that you can have a giant nationwide conversation about some of these things. And I think a lot of the specific examples of constitutional change will leave an awful lot of people really feeling very cold. They'll say, constitutional convention, it'll be a talking shop. And there are all sorts of difficulties. I mean, you mentioned some of them. Do you have a random choice of people from the public with the option that they don't have to go and join in? Do you have experts? Do you have it dominated by the politicians, so everybody will think will fix it for their own ends? I think that so many of these things are difficult. I think we're all, or most of us, I'm sure, are really interested in some of the detail, but the public aren't. I think Andrew's right that what you need to do is to provide better, stronger growth, more jobs, this kind of thing, but I think that is often much harder harder done than easier to say than to do, and I think we found that over the years. And the politicians trying always to pretend they can deliver on everything. We've got the answer. We'll do it. And if only it's our party, we'll make it so much more easy. And you know that they're lying through their teeth half the time. I mean, again, the row over the autumn statement with Danny Alexander and George Osborne, all cosy, and here is our joint autumn statement, and this is all going to be fantastic. And then almost instantly, they're practically tearing each other's eyes out and saying, well, you know, Osborne saying it'll be chaos if anybody, including the Lib Dems, take over. And it just isn't credible. And that's the problem. Politicians have just so lost credibility, even though many of them, as Katie said, actually work very hard.
At least Danny Alexander turned up for the autumn statement, yeah? Jim?
Yeah, Nick Clegg was away looking at a road, wasn't he? It's the perfect time to go and look at a road. Anyway, I agree with Nick. I don't think many people will say that at the election. I wasn't going to say anything, but I just kind of picking up on a couple of points that folk have mentioned, is that I think the easy and lazy thing to do is to blame the electoral system. So I'm not trying to, the gentleman there who asked the question, I'm not having a dig at you or anyone in the panel, but there's the evidence cuts all sorts of ways as to whether the electoral system boosts turnout, reduces turnout, encourages apathy, encourages or incites interest. And the peculiar thing in the UK at the minute is that we have a first-past-the-post system for the House of Commons, which has created a coalition government, and we had a proportional representation system in the Scottish Parliament that created a majority government. So both of those two parliaments had the opposite electoral makeup for which the electoral mechanisms were designed. But I think the genuinely lazy way of analysing the country's problems is electoral systems. I say that as someone who instinctively is in favour of first-past-the-post, so I kind of lay my cards on the table, but also someone who, you might think I'm a big-headed git generally, but the nice thing for me at the last election in my seat, we had the highest turnout of any constituency anywhere in the UK. Now, that wasn't because of an electoral system, but because the politics seemed to matter and it was about round-the-clock engagement. And the last thing to maybe mention is this point about all politicians being hypocrites. And I know it's said partly for effect. All politicians aren't hypocrites in the same way that all journalists aren't useless. But both professions, and every profession has great people and some less great people. There's some great bus drivers and some bloody awful bus drivers. But the point, I think, and I'll be careful because there's a TV kind of recording there, is that how many of you would vote for a politician or a political party who says, vote for me and I'll change nothing? Vote, I have no dream. I mean, how would that speech have been? I have no dream. And when I get you there, I mean, it just doesn't. So politics is about promising change without, kind of emphasising the upside without being honest about the downside quite often. There is no magic answer to any of the country's problems, of any country. Every party, no matter who wins, has got a bloody hard job to do. And I think if I was given advice, incidentally, I'm on the hopefully on Saturday, I'm going to start a new career as the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. I've had enough of this Westminster stuff. I never liked it anyway. But my point isn't about that. My point is that I think there's a bit of a moment where a politician says, "This is what I'd like to do. It's going to be bloody hard. I'm going to try my best to get us there, but we're going to have to try it together." Rather than saying, "Vote for me, and the sky will be free of any clouds." But I'm not sure what the public appetite is for a politician at the other end of the scale who says, "Do you know, I think things are okay the way they are, and I'm not going to change very much." Now, that's not me blaming the voters for the governments they get, but it's just a reflection of the dynamic of elections.
Well, I think this is the last time you hear Jim Murphy saying he hasn't got all the answers to all the problems. From Saturday, he'll have them all.
Yeah.
And
Andrew's going to tell me them all.
Just a quick one. When I was in the SDP and the Young politics, lecturer at another university, I drafted an entire written constitution, complete with a scheme for a reformed and elected House of Lords, for the single transferable vote in multi-member constituencies, for a new-fangled ombudsman. It was a wonderful constitution. If only it had been implemented, all of Britain's problems over the last 30 years would have magically vanished. But as I get older and more jaded, I become less and less convinced that changing the constitutional structure makes much difference. It is the quality of leadership and the quality of decisions that matters. Now, there are some big things that do matter in democracy. You've got to have the ability for the people to express a clear choice, and that's why actually I'm, on balance, think that first past the post is the best system. It enables you to express a clear choice. You've got to have mechanisms that hold people to account, and if you don't have those, then you open yourself to corruption. And you've also got to have political systems that enable leaders to lead, which is why I've become a very strong advocate of elected mayors for major cities. You've actually got to have people who you put in, you give a job, they've got the authority. If you don't like what they're doing, you can vote them out. But I think it's a few big reforms that you need, which focus on the quality of leadership and the quality of the choice that matters. And I do think it would be quite a big distraction for England, which clearly doesn't want it, according to polls, to go into a massively convoluted navel-gazing 5 years, producing a massive shopping list of potential reforms that turn the voters cold and which end up not being implemented anyway. And I can tell you as a member of the House of Lords, I cannot tell you how many weeks the House of Lords has spent debating its own future. I mean, there's nothing that gets them out in large numbers. It's 300 quid a day tax-free members. There's quite a strong vested interest in people staying there. They all turn up in massive, massive numbers to debate different schemes for reforming the House of Lords. There was a debate on the autumn statement last week, which had relatively few speakers. We were debating the governance and leadership of the major cities on Thursday, which I think is a very, very big issue facing the country, given that most of England's cities aren't in great shape, and there aren't many people speaking there. I think what people want in England, there's a big national issue in Scotland. I think the politics there are very different, but in England is politicians who don't claim to have all the answers, but do spend more time focusing on trying to provide some solutions and not just navel-gazing about changing the rules of the game.
Well, thank you very much. Unless somebody's got an absolutely burning question. Has anyone got one? No? Okay. I think we'll draw it to a close there. So, can I say on behalf of Kings and Ipsos MORI, a very big thank you to you all for coming. Please join us for a drink and a canapé in Chapters, and please join me in thanking our panel.